To Midnight in America. I'm your host, Salvatore Babones, and Midnight in America is your weekly source for the most provocative public affairs content on the internet. This week's guest is Norwegian political scientist Glenn Diesen, who will discuss Russia's geoeconomic strategy for a Greater Eurasia. It's Midnight in America, 4 p.m. in Sydney, Australia. Glenn Diesen, what time is it in Norway?
Well, here it's 6 a.m. in the morning, so yeah, you got me nice and early. Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Thanks for being on this show. At 6 a.m., that's a tough ask to get up at 6 a.m. on Saturday morning to do a modest live stream interview show like this. So I really have to thank you, Glenn, for doing the show. Starting the technical material at 5:30 a.m. You must be very passionate about this subject. And
yes, try to be.
And I'll say passionate enough to have written a book about it. So here I'll just focus on the book, Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for a Greater Eurasia, with Routledge. That's by our guest, Glenn Diesen. And of course, I'd like to recommend the book to anyone watching the live stream. Glenn, why don't we just jump right into it? You know, when I think of Russia, I think geopolitics. You know, I think invasions of Georgia, invasions of Ukraine, you know, tanks and special forces. I don't usually think geoeconomics. So why do you think Russia has become a geoeconomic power?
I think Russia's striving to become a geoeconomic power. So again, just the basic assumptions of geoeconomics then will be that power derives from controlling international markets, as opposed to what you refer to as geopolitics, which focus mostly on controlling territory and weapons. Now, I'm not arguing Russia is completely decoupled from geopolitics. However, the examples you just mentioned, I would argue, demonstrates that Russia is using mostly military power to preserve the status quo when geoeconomic power doesn't work. So if you use the example of Ukraine,
okay.
Russia used a lot of economic tools in order to extend its lease on the naval base in Sevastopol. It's trying to use a lot of economic tools to reach a post-Cold War settlement with Europe. But the military is, of course, still used, but mostly to preserve red lines. That is, when it perceived the West to essentially try to convert Georgia and Ukraine into this bulwark for Western influence. For example, the support for removing Yanukovych from power in Ukraine, Russia is then willing to step in with military power. However, back to the question of geoeconomics, Russia definitely attempts to develop more economic tools. Needless to say, it still has a far way to go, but what it has discovered is in order to become a geoeconomic actor, it can't really do it from Europe, being at the periphery of Europe. Instead, its main geoeconomic power derives from essentially repositioning itself from the periphery of Europe to the center of this new Eurasian constellation it's attempting to put together.
Well, you talk about Russia being at the periphery of Europe, and I know in your book you talk about, I think it's called the Eurasian Economic Union, but the idea that there would be a single market from Lisbon to Vladivostok, you know, a single Eurasian market that would integrate Russia into Europe. Can you tell us about that and tell us what happened to it?
Well, that has been a very long-standing objective for Russia. I mean, even before the Russian Federation became independent, even all the way back to Gorbachev, the idea was that Russia should create this common European home and essentially bring the European continent together. And this was the goal from Yeltsin also to Putin, to have this Greater Europe, where Russia is essentially included, as opposed to having it solely driven by institution which largely excludes Russia. Now, Russia believed it was making some progress with this in terms of reaching agreements with the European Union to harmonize integration efforts, to essentially remove this zero-sum component of European integration. However, after Ukraine, much like the West felt betrayed, Russia also felt betrayed, and even the greatest optimists for this Greater Europe then abandoned this project, and they instead believed that the future would belong in Greater Eurasia.
Right.
Now, I use the word periphery simply because this is where Russia finds itself. I mean, let's not pretend the West doesn't try to engage Russia, but when we engage Russia, it's usually through institutions such as the EU, where we use collective bargaining power. So essentially 28 countries come together and try to dictate the format for cooperation, so the trade rules and the trade regime.
Right. I mean, you're talking to us from Norway, and I believe you are Norwegian yourself. What kind of economic ties are there? If we just focus on Europe for now, we'll get to Asia in a few minutes. What kind of economic ties are there between Norway and Russia, for example?
Well, Norway and Russia would have some shared industries, I mean, fishing, some agriculture. We have similar industries, though. Norway has also become quite dependent on natural resources, so we export oil, gas.
Right.
But the trade relationship between Russia and Europe has mostly been problematic for the Russians because they have mostly been an exporter of natural resources.
Right.
And this has been the so-called energy curse for them. They have had easy access to large revenue by selling their energy at high prices, and this easy export has made it, I guess, too easy for Russia to obtain all this easy money, and for this reason they've avoided very painful economic reforms and often imported the manufactured goods they need as opposed to simply constructing it themselves. So essentially the huge energy reserves has contributed to deindustrializing Russia rather than helping it. So what they are seeking now to do is, instead of using that revenue to lay on the lazy side, they would like to use some of this money to subsidize new industries, so more high-tech,
So when I think of high-tech Russia, I mean, obviously there's the aerospace and military industrial complex, but I also think of the space industry, and I'm wondering if you have any insights into high-tech Russia.
Well, high-tech Russia, they of course have can build on their advantages, be it in the military or space. The main issue in geoeconomics would be then to create some synergy effects to allow them to convert essentially a lot of these military space industries into commercial enterprises. So again, in the past, it was assumed that it was feared that technologies used for in commerce for businesses could be transferred in and given a military application. In the era of geoeconomics, the logic goes the other way, that countries can use military technology or and give these benefits in commerce and business. Right. So I guess that's one area that Russia can draw upon, the somewhat technological leadership in military and the area of space, of course.
Right. I mean, you make the point that, you know, from a European perspective, Russia is a periphery and maybe, you know, economically backward compared to Europe. But compared to much of Eurasia, Russia might be thought of as an economic leader, or, you know, certainly Russian experts are, you know, ever present throughout Central Asia. At least that's my understanding. I've never been to the region. You know, to what extent is this new Eurasia, you know, an effort by Russia to play in a game where it can be the leader instead of playing in a game where it's inevitably the follower?
Well, definitely, Russia would like to re-establish some of its authority with countries which it has traditionally had very close ties with. So, at the heart of this Greater Eurasia, you of course find the Central Asian countries, former Soviet republics, which economically compared to Russia are much weaker. However, this Greater Eurasia encompasses a much greater space, so it also includes countries from South Korea, China, India, Iran, and conceptually it also includes Europe. So if we look in Asia, you don't only have this relatively weaker Central Asian countries, you also have big economic powerhouses such as China. And compared to China, of course, Russia's economy is much weaker. So it's far from the dominant power in Greater Eurasia. I would argue, instead of seeking leadership or even global leadership, aspiring for this, such as it did during the Cold War, its ambitions are much more, less ambitious. I think it's simply seeking a greater seat at the table, a favorable balance of dependence, if you want.
Right. So, I want to know, do you really see Russia as being, in some sense, at the heart of Eurasian economy, or just like with Europe, is Russia on the periphery of a Eurasian economy? Just the opposite periphery?
Well, that's a good question, because one of the big fears of Russia when trying to redirect its economy and diversifying away from this excessive dependence on Europe and also reaching out to Asia, is one of the fears that it will simply replicate the very asymmetrical economic interdependence it has with Europe. So, for example, by connecting with China, the great fear would be that Russia then becomes China's little brother, and this unequal economic power is then converted into political influence, where the Chinese can tell the Russians what to do. So this is, indeed a great concern. So this is why they're trying, but this is what Eurasia is seen to offer to Russia. It's not simply China or simply Europe. It's rather the geographical space it holds at the geographical center of Eurasia. So it can diversify its own ties. It can establish physical, economic connectivity across the continent, as well as set up new trade relationships. So, I guess the geographical so-called land bridge Russia wants to create is, for example, energy pipelines stretching from all the way to Europe, and also supplying the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Chinese, and then transportation corridors, much like you're very familiar with the Chinese one road, one belt. The Russians have their own format for this, and they would of course prefer if the Chinese used Russian territory to transit, but essentially conceptually making Russia this bridge between Asia and Europe with energy pipelines, transportation corridors, and establishing this new mechanism for cooperation. So joining investment banks from east to west, and trying to promote more diversifying use of currencies.
So I understand how being a transportation corridor and an information corridor, I mean, it's not just trains, it's fiber optic cable, it's all sorts of connective tissue. I understand how being a corridor gives Russia geoeconomic power, in the sense that it can always cut the pipeline. But how does it actually help Russia in any way? I mean, other than giving it the power to suspend a rail service or cut off a internet cable, what good is it for Russia being essentially a transit territory?
Well, what you refer to would be more punitive efforts. I don't think it's only used for coercion. It's rather to, I guess, elevate Russia's market value. So if you are a Eurasian power, then at the heart of Eurasia, the idea would be for Europe, China, South Korea, all these countries to become more reliant on Russia. And meanwhile, Russia becomes less dependent on any one actor or any one region in the world. And I guess part of this problem is to escape this very asymmetrical interdependence it has, again, with Europe, where Russia becomes more dependent on Europe than Europe is on Russia. Now, the purpose of this would be to essentially shift this balance of dependence by making Russia less dependent on others and others more dependent on Russia. So, simply to have a bit higher negotiation power, and also not being, I guess, often pushed into a corner as it sees, which is being done in Europe. So, for example, the sanctions the United States and Europe has put against Russia, we can assume that they wouldn't have been so aggressive if Russia would have had better partnerships with other parts of the world. And yeah, so that's part of the reason. It's trying to avoid this economic pressure from other countries. So this does not only go into physical transportation corridors, but even minor things such as currencies. If it's too dependent on trading in US dollars or the euro, it becomes very vulnerable to sanctions. So essentially it goes back to only diversifying away from any reliance on one country or region.
But again, forgive me for being very skeptical. I agree with everything you're saying about Russia needing to make itself more important to these countries. For example, I think an important reason why China has not faced the kind of economic sanctions from the West, and particularly from the United States, that Russia has, is that thousands of American companies are highly invested in China, and Chinese industry is closely connected with American industry, and there's a Starbucks on every corner in Shanghai. Cutting off China would be, as we say, to cut off your nose to spite your face. Even if Russia has transit rail routes and transit pipelines, that's not really, to my mind, that's not a very deep relationship in the way that, for example, the economic relationship between the US and China is incredibly deep and closely intertwined. Simply providing a rail service, to me, seems to pale by comparison.
Yes, you're correct, but that wouldn't be the only component of this geoeconomic influence in Eurasia. Again, it looks at, I would argue, three major areas. The first would be Russia seeks to develop more strategic industries. Now, the problem with Europe has been Russia desperately needs some partners to modernize. The Europeans have always put a lot of conditions on trade and assisting Russia to modernize its economy, mostly in return for getting some influence into its domestic affairs. So the reason why Europe has been able to put these conditions on Russia is simply because they knew Russia has nowhere else to go. Now, by, for example, setting up new relationships with Korea, Japan, all these very energy-hungry countries with high technologies, Russia hopes to also be able to modernize its industries and therefore develop more, I guess, dependence on Russia in these areas. And of course, not just transportation corridors, this is easy to avoid Russia as well, but the energy corridors are quite important as well. Again, we often focus on how the West is, or Europe is very dependent on Russian oil and gas. However, this hasn't really translated into political influence because Russia has been equally dependent on Europe as a source of, for demand, as an energy consumer. Now, what they hope to do is then shift away from this reliance on Europe. So if they become less dependent on Europe and Europe becomes more dependent on Russia, this would definitely not the same level as the dependence relationship between the US and China, but it would still be favorable to what it is today.
Right.
And of course, lastly, you have these mechanisms for cooperation. So I mentioned before, if you seek investments, you have to come knock on the door of the West, but instead seek a reliance on different investors, different set of currencies, and different trade regimes, and economic partnerships. So it's not just the railroads, of course, but there's assumed to be a lot of synergy effects there.
Right. In my own writing for Russian websites, I've written a little bit for Russia and Global Affairs and the Russian International Affairs Council. My advice to Russia as an outsider has consistently been that Russia should seek true economic integration in the form of integrated production networks and supply chains and value chains. And I've given them the example that in the Far East, Russia could seek to develop an aerospace an integrated aerospace industry that spans the borders of the Russian Far East, China, South Korea, and Japan, bringing all of those into an integrated aerospace industry production network. And the feedback I've received from Russians has been that, well, we don't want to be dependent on these neighbors. To which I've said to them, no, it's not about being dependent on the neighbors, it's about making everybody dependent on each other. But my impression has been that my Russian interlocutors have very much seen things in autarkic terms, that they think Russia has to have a full supply chain for its Far Eastern aerospace industry within Russia alone. Is that your impression of Russian thinking? I mean, you know Russian thinking much better than I do. Do you think Russians are really up for the idea of joining regional networks?
Well, I definitely think they're prepared to join a lot of these international networks. They are, however, very concerned about ending up at the lower end of global value chains, simply becoming, well, again, for example, an energy supplier. Now, they do also favor there for certain autarky. I mean, then the nuclear industry would be a very good example where Russia essentially can form partnership with any countries to build nuclear plants. They can build the plants for them, they can supply the fuels, they can operate these plants, and at the end they can discard of radioactive waste. So essentially controlling all parts of all parts of the business cycle. Now, obviously you can't do this in all economically interdependent relationship, but they would like to make sure that they don't end up in the similar vulnerable position they have in Europe, where they become more dependent on Europe than Europe is on Russia. So I guess that's part of the dilemma you have in geoeconomics. On one hand, if you want to prosper, you do have to create economic interdependence with other countries, but if they become more dependent, if they are less dependent on you than you are on them, you set yourself in a very vulnerable position where they can use this very asymmetrical economic interdependence and convert it into political influence. And I guess this is Russia's great fear in Asia, because they are not the most powerful economic power there. You have the Chinese, you have the Japanese. There's a lot of huge economic powers there. So they're very careful not to replicate this unfavorable relationship they have in the West. But of course, at some point, as I agree with you, you have to find some kind of a middle ground. As if you want to become completely self-reliant, you're going to end up like North Korea, shut off from the rest of the world. And that's definitely not the purpose, or at least the strategy the Russians have.
But then, and I think that the nuclear industry is emblematic of this, that Russia has developed its nuclear cooperation as you suggest, as a turnkey industry. They can provide the fuel, they can take care of the waste, they can provide the technical expertise, they can, they can do it all, right, on a turnkey basis, which is something very different from the true integration of, say, the mobile phone industry in East Asia, where, nobody can make a mobile phone. I mean, there's no country in the world, not even China, can make a mobile phone. You need components from Japan, you need components from you need components from Japan, you need components from Korea, components from Taiwan, components from China, software from the US. So even though Russia can make an entire nuclear power plant, no country can make one of these, right? Even the United States or China can't make a simple mobile phone. And this is a difference in philosophy. Do you think that Russian philosophy is successful for Russia? I mean, is it one that will lead to people being better off or the country being more secure?
Well, I think there's a process they have to go through of essentially establishing themselves competitive in international markets. Now, it's very hard to integrate yourself into these very open, free markets unless you have competitiveness in these markets. Now, yeah, the phone industry would be a good example, but well, historically, how great powers have acted would be to initially in the early stages provide subsidies as well as issuing tariffs to protect local industries. Now, a good example would be again the Russian car industry, or what they're trying to do now with the airline industry, would be to set conditions for selling in Russia, because they do have a big market, and if you want to sell there, you're going to have to produce a lot of the cars in Russia. So essentially emulating a lot of the strategies which the Chinese have had. And as they essentially put conditions on using local workers, they create a lot of local know-how, develop a lot of domestic capabilities, and then slowly begin to accept more exposure to these open markets as well. But at some point they do have to seek some independence as well. Otherwise, what would be completely open markets would essentially be the Chinese and Americans supplying the phones, and Russia simply becoming consumer, paying for it with oil and gas. Right. So again, this is not that unusual. It is something that all rising powers have done.
Well, but do you see Russia as a rising power?
Sorry?
Do you see Russia as a rising power?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because this is often very contested.
It is. Yes.
Yeah, so many see it as a declining power. Indeed, if you read The Economist, they've been predicting for the last 20 years that Russia is, collapsing any day now. So there is very different views, and that's not to mock the views that many perceive Russia to be a declining power, because they do have a lot of weaknesses and problems they have to resolve. I can appreciate those arguments. I would, however, argue that Russia appears to be moving in the right direction by implementing these geoeconomic policies. I guess they still have a far way to go. Under Putin, what they first attempted to do was, from the 2000s, reassert state control over strategic industries, so that its energy industry was working, was harmonized with Russia's foreign policy interests, as opposed to falling under foreign control and being used against Russia. So they created these huge national giants who can go out in the world and actually compete. Now, they became too dependent on them, and now the main objective appears to be diversify away from it. However, they then need to build these actual industries, and I think they're moving in the direction to actually do this. But again, there's a far way to go, and a lot of things can go wrong. So it's hard to say if they will be successful or not, but I would probably tick it off as being a rising power in terms of how we measure its influence abroad, not just in military power, but also economic influence as well.
Right. Now, we're coming close to the end of the show. You know that I would love to talk about this subject with you for hours, and we have talked about it for hours, and I'm looking forward to our next opportunity to talk about it for hours. But for now, I just like to put back up the book and to ask you, if you have any other major theses in the book, anything people should know about the book that we haven't covered, any big ideas that you'd really like to make sure people know, and that might inspire them to go out and read the book themselves.
Well, I guess a key component of this strategy would be Russia really needs a close partnership with China, because, as you're aware, they're the main country who has geoeconomic power and the willingness to actually go and challenge this very Western-centric system. Now, the problem with this will be that Russia becomes very dependent on China. So the main argument being put forward in the book is, in order for Russia to link itself in a sustainable relationship with China, it also at the same time needs to diversify away from China. So if it's going east, it can't only be dependent on China, rather it also has to reach out to South Korea, Japan, India, Iran, and all these other countries in the east. So it's yeah, again, it's a very grand project, and often when we say Eurasia, it's often assumed that it's simply an effort to integrate the former Soviet space. However, these ambitions are much greater than that.
You know, I think people might be surprised to hear that Russia has a very good relationship, not just with North Korea, but actually with South Korea. But the relationship with Japan is perennially strained by the fact that there's still not a peace treaty between Japan and Russia over World War II and the island dispute. Do you think there are good prospects for Russia and Japan to just get the island dispute out of the way and have better relations in the future?
Well, I guess over the last 2 years you have seen this development with the Japanese, because the Japanese have always been hostile to establish this economic connectivity with Russia until they resolved the territorial dispute over the southern Kuril Islands. However, what you're seeing now is the Japanese are more willing to delay that and look at it a different day. And one of the reasons is some of the dynamic of this Greater Eurasia. That is, as Russia links itself closer with China, it's more Japan has the same interest as Russia. It needs to create more economic connectivity with the Russians. Otherwise, if Russia becomes too dependent on China, eventually you will see Russia's somewhat neutral status in the conflict between Japan and China disappear, and so essentially Russia would then become less autonomous and become China allied against the Japanese. This is something that the Japanese seek to avoid. So for this reason, they now have to compromise a bit on their stance the last few decades, which has been no economic connectivity, substantial at least, without resolving the territorial dispute. So I think the last meeting between Putin and Abe, you saw this, the Japanese moving in this direction, more willingness to sign economic agreements with Russia without resolving this dispute. So that's, I guess, one of the benefits in Eurasia would be Russia is not the most dominant power. So you have this interest by the South Koreans, the Japanese, all of them to reach out to Russia to make sure Russia doesn't become too dependent on the Chinese either.
Right. Now, thank you very much for being on the show. And once again, we've been discussing this book, Russia's Geoeconomic Strategy for a Greater Eurasia by Glenn Diesen. But Glenn, you are an amazingly productive scholar, and I happen to know that your next book is already on the way, and that it's a much more deeply theoretical book, not so much focused on the day-to-day of international relations, but on some very deep philosophy about why don't I let you tell people about it for 1 or 2 minutes while I kind of get the technical details wrapped up here for the end of the podcast. Tell us about your next book.
Well, my next book has this somewhat dramatic title, I guess. It's called The Decay of Western Civilization and the Resurgence of Russia. Now, what it essentially sets out to explore is something less dramatic, which is simply the rise of these populists across the West, so from Trump, Le Pen, and across the European continent. And so not only, first the rise of the populists, but also look into their affinity towards Russia. And essentially the argument would be that a lot of these populists are, I guess we'll call classical conservatives, who essentially recognize that classical conservatism in the West has been decimated by this excessive neoliberalism, and they look towards often towards Russia because they embrace a very unapologetic and very bold neo-modernist view, where they believe you can't modernize without reproducing the past as well. So essentially striking a balance between conservatism and modernism, something that the West was developed on as well, and I think we forgot about. So again, we can discuss that in greater length next time. We will.
Now, I know that when you talk about that Russian-inspired conservatism, you're talking about people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and people like Marine Le Pen in France. I have to ask, are you also talking about Donald Trump?
To a large extent, yes. There's some differences between Trump and the European populists, but I guess Trump is an interesting case. But of course, I would argue, I know we differ a bit on this point, but I do believe that he falls within that category, simply because a lot of the ideological spokespeople from his camp, not anymore, but before, people like Steve Bannon, what they were promoting was essentially, cultural conservatism. They promoted bringing back the American system, and a lot of these ideas rejecting this new postmodernist leaning of the West, and instead reproducing its traditions and being very unapologetic about it.
Right.
I think that puts him in the camp with the rest of this, with this populist. Whether or not he's a classical conservativist, some people disagree, but of course, him and many of his peers take the same position towards Russia as well, because in the past, since the Cold War, we essentially redivided the world between liberal democracies and authoritarians. And what the populists are doing is essentially redrawing this division, saying, no, this is not the main battle line for civilization. What we have is competition between nationalists and cosmopolitans, it's between patriots and globalists. And I guess Trump definitely, with his America First strategy or policy, it falls in the same category as the Russians, where they look towards being more traditionalist, nationalist, patriots, and rejecting some of this cosmopolitan and globalist ethos, which not just politically but economically has caused a lot of problems across the West.
All right. Well, great. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there because our time is up. I want to apologize to people who wanted to call in because we had some technical problems that prevented us opening the call-in lines. I'm sure that when Glenn is back on the program, and Glenn, I know you're going to be back on the program later this year to discuss your next book. When Glenn's back on the program, hopefully we'll have the call-in lines up and running, and I think a lot of people are going to want to call in on that show. Glenn Diesen, thank you very much for appearing so early in the morning on Midnight in America. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. Next week, we'll have Richard Heydarian, who will be discussing the Duterte regime in the Philippines. Don't miss it. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and we'll see you next week.